On the morning of December 7, 1909, a railroad car ferry named the Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 pulled away from the coal dock at Conneaut, Ohio, and turned north into a rising sea. Her captain was Robert McLeod, a Lake Erie man of long service, known along the waterfront as a careful master who did not take risks he could avoid. The ship beneath him was more than 300 feet of riveted steel, launched at Cleveland 4 years earlier, and built for one job: to carry the weight of loaded freight cars across open water to Port Stanley, on the Canadian shore, a crossing of roughly 60 miles she had made hundreds of times. On her deck that morning sat some 30 loaded cars, most of them filled with coal. Around and below them worked a crew of 30-some men and at least one officer of the company who had come aboard with business of his own. The wind was already strong when she cleared the breakwater. It would build into one of the worst storms the lake had thrown in years, and by the time it passed, the Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 had vanished with every man aboard her. In the more than 100 years since, no one has found the hull. What the lake gave back, it gave back in pieces, and the pieces have never added up to an answer. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What the lake took that night was not a small or marginal vessel. The Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 was a working steel ship, well regarded on the lower lakes, built to cross in nearly any season and trusted to do it. Car ferries of her kind were among the largest commercial vessels on Lake Erie, and they had to be. A single loaded coal car weighed many tons, and she carried rows of them chained to rails that ran the length of her main deck, from the bow back toward the stern, where the cars were rolled on and off. That open stern was the cost of the design. To load and unload rail cars at speed, the after end of the ship sat lower and more exposed than the stern of an ordinary freighter, and this vessel had no full sea gate to seal it against a sea coming up from behind. In calm water it made no difference. In a December gale, running before the wind with the waves short and steep, it made all the difference there was. Lake Erie is the shallowest of the 5 Great Lakes, with an average depth of only about 60 feet, and that shallowness is exactly what makes its storms so dangerous. Deep water absorbs a storm. Shallow water throws it back, in waves that stack up close and steep and breaking, the worst sea a ship can meet with a low stern and a heavy load on deck. The crossing to Port Stanley ran barely 60 miles, and for almost all of it she was never more than 30 or 40 miles from a shoreline. A steel ship of her size, that close to land, on water that shallow, should not have been able to vanish without leaving a wreck that someone could find. That is the first fact in this case that refuses to settle. People on shore knew the ferry was in trouble before she was gone. Through that night and into the next day, residents along the lake reported hearing a steamer's whistle out in the dark, blowing the short repeated blasts that carry one meaning on the water: distress. The sound rose and fell as the wind shifted. Lights were seen far out and then lost. Someone aboard the Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 was signaling, for hours, into a storm no lifeboat could be launched into from any harbor on the lake. Then the whistle stopped and was not heard again. What the lake returned, it returned days later, and it returned almost nothing. One of the ferry's lifeboats was found adrift in the open water, far from the course she should have held, carrying the bodies of part of her crew. The men in it, 9 by most accounts, had frozen to death where they sat. One was found with his arms fixed in the motion of bailing. The water that had filled the boat turned to ice around him. They had gotten off the ship. They had launched a boat in a gale, in darkness, in cold that kills in minutes, and they had lived through the launch only to die in the open lake with no land within reach. The boat was real, and the bodies were real, and together they proved the ship had not gone down in a single instant. There had been time aboard her. There had been an attempt to live, and the attempt had ended as a boat of frozen men with no ship anywhere near it. The captain was not among them. Robert McLeod's body was never recovered, then or in any year since. Neither was the body of the officer who had boarded at Conneaut, a man named Albert Weis, who by the accounts of the day was carrying a large sum of the company's money, a figure usually put in the tens of thousands of dollars, meant for work at the Canadian harbor. The money was never found. For days afterward, the eastern shores were walked and watched, and wreckage came in as fragments, a piece of cabin, splintered planking, the broken furniture of a ship that had come apart. None of it fixed the location of the hull. None of it explained how, in 60 miles of crossing on a lake 60 feet deep, a vessel of more than 300 feet of steel had reached the bottom and left no mark anyone could follow. The response moved through the means that existed in 1909. The United States Life-Saving Service and the boats of other companies searched as the weather let them. The loss filled the newspapers of Conneaut and Cleveland and Erie, and the towns along the Canadian shore reported in the close detail a disaster of that size demanded. Hard questions were raised about the ship, about the open stern, about whether she should have sailed at all with that sky and that load on deck. But the one record that matters most in any wreck, the vessel's own log, her course and her soundings and her final hours, went down with the ship and with the men who kept it. No one survived to be questioned, no officer remained to testify. The account of what happened aboard the Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 after she passed the breakwater is, and has been from that week to this one, blank. The lake closed over it and kept it. The searching did not end in 1909. In the century that followed, the Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 became one of the lake's standing questions, and people went looking for her with every tool the years made available. Draglines and divers, magnetometers and side-scan sonar, the same equipment that has located far older and far smaller wrecks all across the Great Lakes. Targets were found on the bottom and examined. Claims were made and then withdrawn. A shape that looked right on a sonar screen would turn out to be a natural rise, or another vessel, or nothing at all. More than 100 years on, the largest single mystery on Lake Erie is not some ancient riddle from before the records began. It is a 300-foot steel ship that went down within sight of harbor, in living memory, on the most traveled crossing of the lake, and has never been found. How that is still possible is the part of this story the official account does not like to sit with. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 is the most complete disappearance Lake Erie has ever produced. But it is not the only ship the lake has taken whole, and it is not even the only one taken in that same week. The storm that swallowed her did not stop with one vessel. While she was signaling into the dark off the Ohio shore, another steamer was burning in the western end of the same lake. The Clarion, a wooden steamer working late in the season the way the ferry was, in the last hard push of runs before the lakes closed for winter, caught fire in the Gale near the head of the lake and could not put it out. Part of her crew got off when another passing steamer came close enough through the weather to take them. The rest stayed with the ship, because the fire and the sea between them and rescue left them no way across, and they went down with her when she burned to the water and sank. 2 ships, 2 different deaths, 1 storm, 1 lake, in the same few days of December 1909. The lake did not specialize. It took a ship by fire and a ship by water in the same week, and gave neither crew a fair chance to live. Go back further, and the pattern holds. In October of 1893, a steamer called the Dean Richmond was crossing the lake with a cargo of metal and a crew of roughly 18 men when a gale caught her. She went down with every one of them. No survivor came ashore. For nearly 90 years, no one knew with any certainty where she lay, and the ship passed out of the news and into the long roll of Erie vessels that were simply gone. Then, in the 1980s, divers found her on the bottom off the New York shore near Dunkirk, sitting in the cold fresh water where she had been the whole time. She had not been hidden, she had only never been found, and when she was found, it was not a state agency or a university that found her, it was divers, working on their own, with their own equipment, because the official record had closed the file the day she failed to arrive and never reopened it. Now run the case the other direction. In August of 1852, a passenger steamer named the Atlantic, crowded with immigrants making their way west, collided in the night with a propeller called the Ogdensburg, off Long Point. The Atlantic sank quickly, and the dead numbered in the hundreds, most of them people whose names were never fully recorded. But the Atlantic carried something the Marquette and Bessemer number 2 did not. She carried a strong box of money, the property of an express company, and a large sum of cash on the floor of the lake is a reason. Within a few years, men had located the wreck and begun working it, the safe was brought up, and the ownership of what came out of the water was fought over in court for years afterward. The Atlantic was found because there was money in her worth the cost of going down to get it. That is the variable. The lake gives a wreck back when the reason to retrieve it is large enough, and it keeps the rest. The lake kept doing it into the 20th century. In the October storm of 1916, remembered on the lakes as Black Friday, Erie took several ships in a single day. Some of the men aboard them were pulled from rafts and floating wreckage after long hours in the water. Others went down with their vessels and were never recovered, and at least one of the ships lost that day stayed missing for decades, on a lake where a missing ship is supposed to be impossible. The storms that do this are not rare events separated by lifetimes. They are a feature of the lake, recurring across every generation that has worked it, and each one has added vessels to a flaw that no one has ever fully mapped. Set the cases side by side and the consistency is plain. Lake Erie is shallow and close on every side, and that geography does not protect the ships that cross it. It kills them faster. A storm builds on this lake in hours, the waves come up short and steep, and a vessel in trouble is rarely more than 30 or 40 miles from a shore it cannot reach. Ships go down whole and quick, and once they are down, they are found the same way every time, one at a time, by divers and amateurs and accident, decades after the loss, almost never by any coordinated effort to account for what the lake holds. No one hid these ships. The simpler truth is that finding them was never made anyone's job. The losses were recorded as they happened, in newspapers and insurance ledgers and the registers of lost vessels, and then each one was left where it fell. The records of Erie's dead ships sit scattered across archives in 2 countries, and they have never been gathered into a single map of the flaw that holds them. What the official record did conclude about the Marquette and Bessemer number 2, it concluded about the design. The open stern and the missing sea gate were named, after the fact, as the likely path the lake took into the ship, a following sea boarding the low afterdeck and filling her until she could no longer recover. That finding shaped how later car ferries were built. It did nothing to locate the one that was lost. The families of the crew were left with a verdict about naval architecture and no grave to visit, because the ship that held their husbands and fathers had never been found and would not be. The record could explain, in general terms, how a vessel like her could be lost. It could not say where she was, and on that question it has stayed silent for more than 100 years. What the case demands of that record is uncomfortable because it forces a plain admission. A large steel ship can vanish completely, in the modern era, within sight of a working harbour, on the most heavily travelled crossing of a small lake, and stay vanished for more than a century. The water is not too deep. The lake averages about 60 feet, and the corridor she was lost in is shallower than the lake as a whole. She did not go down far from anyone either. She was crossing a lane that ships used every week between Conneaut on the American side and Port Stanley and Long Point on the Canadian side, a stretch you could draw a box around on a chart and cross in an afternoon in fair weather. She is somewhere inside that box. The reason she has never been found is not distance and not depth. It is that no one has ever mapped the bottom of that box and looked at everything in it. The evidence survives, and it survives in better condition than almost anyone outside the Great Lakes expects. Cold fresh water does to a wreck what salt water never does. It preserves it. The steel does not corrode the way it corrodes in the ocean. The timber is not eaten away by the organisms that destroy wrecks in salt water, and the cold and the dark hold a ship close to the state it was in when it sank. Vessels have been found in the Great Lakes more than a century after going down with their pilot houses still standing, their cargo still in place, their fittings still on the walls. If the Marquette and Bessemer number 2 were found tomorrow, the chances are good that she would be substantially whole, the cars still chained to her deck, the men still aboard her where the cold took them. The evidence is not destroyed. It has only never been visited. It is lying under 60-some feet of fresh water, inside a search box you could survey in a single season, waiting for an instrument to pass over it. The looking has been hard, for a concrete reason. Lake Erie's bottom in places is soft, a deep layer of silt and mud carried in over centuries, and a heavy steel ship that drove into it in a storm can settle below the surface of the floor, so that sonar sweeping the bottom passes over a shape with almost nothing left standing above the mud to return an echo. A buried hull is a harder target than a wreck sitting proud on hard bottom. That is a real obstacle, and it is also an argument for better instruments rather than for stopping. Magnetometers read the iron and steel of a buried ship straight through the sediment that hides it from sonar. Sub-bottom profilers see down into the floor itself. The means to find a buried steel hull in soft bottom exist and are in ordinary use. They have simply never been brought to bear on the whole corridor where the ferry was lost, and the instruments are not exotic and have not been for a long time. Multi-beam sonar mounted under a survey boat draws the bottom in fine detail. Side-scan sonar towed behind one finds the shapes that do not belong, the long straight lines and right angles of a hull standing out against a natural floor that has none. This is the equipment that maps shipping channels and lays pipelines and finds far older and far smaller wrecks all over the world, and there are universities, agencies and survey firms within an hour of the Erie shore that own it and run it. The conditions for looking have improved on top of that. Over the last 30 years, invasive mussels have filtered the water of the lower lakes to a clarity Erie has not had in living memory, so that divers and cameras can now see on the bottom what was lost in murk for most of the 20th century. The cost of a full survey is small against the budget of any one of those institutions. The full survey has never been done. Pieces of the lake have been mapped, for harbours and cables and shoreline studies, and the occasional proposal to set aside a stretch of bottom for the wrecks already on it. Individual ships have been found, dived, photographed, and added to the record one at a time, but no one has ever set out to map the entire floor of Lake Erie and account for everything resting on it, the way it could be accounted for with tools that already exist. The Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 has been searched for, on and off, for 100 years. She has never been systematically surveyed for. Those are not the same activity, and the gap between them is the gap between a story that stays open forever and a question that finally closes. Searching is a boat going out to look at a hunch. Surveying is mapping the whole floor until there is nowhere left for the ship to be. One has been tried for a century. The other has never been attempted across the full lake. So return to the morning it started. December 7th, 1909. The coal dock at Conneaut. Robert McLeod taking his ship past the breakwater and turning her north into a sea that was already rising. Everything after that turn is unrecorded, because the only record went down with the men who kept it. But the ending is not unknown. The ship is on the floor of Lake Erie. She has been there for more than 100 years, in cold fresh water that has almost certainly kept her, with her captain and the officer who carried the company's money, and the crew who never reached the boat still aboard, somewhere in a stretch of shallow water between two shores that ships cross every day. The lake did not hide her. No one hid her. The floor that holds her has simply never been mapped, and the only thing standing between the question and the answer is 60 feet of fresh water and the decision to look at all of it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.